right now, I want to turn it over to our partners from Microsoft, Marissa Hugh-Weller from Microsoft in a conversation with Campaign Zero, Sam Sinyangwe, on connecting data to impact and transforming the criminal justice system. Marissa?
Hi, Ed. Thank you so much. My name is Marissa Hugh-Weller, and I have the privilege of leading the Justice Reform Initiative at Microsoft. And part of what that means is getting to work with organizations like Campaign Zero, who seek to use data and technology to advance a more equitable criminal justice system. And so I've asked Kevin Miller on my team, who leads our strategic partnerships, to come on and talk a little bit more about that, to introduce Sam, and then Kevin will be back as we do Q&A toward the end of my conversation with Sam. Over to you, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Good morning. So it's great to be with you here this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. So again, my name is Kevin Miller. I lead our strategic partnerships for the Justice Reform Initiative at Microsoft, where we partner with mission-driven organizations and reform-minded institutions to drive more equitable justice system for communities of color. So today, we're really here to talk about connecting data to impact. As a funder in this space, and one that obviously, thinks a lot about the opportunity for technology and data to contribute to justice reform and social impact. I see over and over again that it's sort of not enough to be just putting these tools and data infrastructure in place without thinking about levers and mechanisms for impact and connecting those tools to the human beings right on the ground that are doing the work. So, I think if we really want to think about substantive change and truly meaningful outcomes, it takes a lot of work, right? And that's okay. But while it takes a lot of work, the impact of these data-informed initiatives, I think especially when coupled with, thoughtful stakeholder engagement, advocacy, and sort of this deep thinking around, strategic execution, can really be incredibly powerful. So with that, I want to bring Marissa back and also introduce Sam Sinyangwe for a conversation about connecting data to impact and the opportunities and challenges associated with Sam's journey as co-founder of Campaign Zero and the architect of the Policing Scorecard Initiative, which we're super excited about and which I'm excited to have you all hear more about as well. So Sam is an incredible visionary and leader working to end police violence and systemic racism in the United States by working closely with organizers across the country to use data to hold police accountable and change laws and policies that structure police violence. As many of you also know, he's a proven expert at connecting data to impact, which is why I'm super excited to have him here today with us. And with that, I will turn it back over to Marissa to kick off the conversation. I hope you all enjoy it.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome, Sam. It's so good to see you. I'd say it's probably the understatement of the year to say you've probably been a little bit busy recently. So let's start with, an audaciously human question, which is to ask you, Sam, how are you? How are you doing?
Yeah, it's been a tough several weeks. It's been a tough several months. It's been a tough several years. I mean, this is another wave of protests and outrage against police violence. And this isn't the first wave that we've seen. I got into this work 6 years ago in the context of the Ferguson uprising. 6 years later, we're still in a position where police violence continues to happen at the same rates that it was happening in 2014 and before that. Same number of people are being killed by police each year. And what's clear is that there's so much more that needs to be done despite all the work that has happened to date to really fundamentally change these dynamics. I'm also, while that is sobering, I'm also excited by so much more of the energy and enthusiasm and radical visioning and demands in this moment that I think have the opportunity to shift the paradigm and put us in a place where some of those changes are possible.
I completely agree. It's been interesting to kind of feel like every day feels very urgent and very important. And then also bear in mind that this moment we're in just didn't materialize out of thin air. A few weeks ago, it's almost, it really is centuries in the making. But I have heard, people say it just feels different. It feels hopeful. I feel for the first time like maybe I should dare to think we could really transform the system. And so without at risk of biasing you, what I'm hoping you might say, do you think this is an inflection point for us right now? Do we have the opportunity to really transform the system?
I do. So I think, in 2014, 2015, 2016, so much of the work was necessarily focused on convincing the nation, and particularly folks in white communities, that this was in fact a crisis, that this was not a series of isolated incidents, and this was not an issue that was limited to a few cities, it was limited to Baltimore or St. Louis, that this was something that was happening all across the country, and that this was a national crisis that demanded a systemic and nationwide approach to the issue. I think now there is actually fairly broad consensus that something is wrong, and that it is something that will require a systemic solution. So I think that is relatively new. And when you look at public opinion polling as well, you see that support for Black Lives Matter has increased substantially over just the past few weeks. We've seen support for the idea that policy solutions need to be implemented to address this issue, that funding priorities within cities need to be restructured to reallocate some of those funds from police departments into community-based alternatives. I think that there's been so much change over just the past month that gives me hope that this is a different kind of moment, where instead of having to fight about why we need change, instead we are able to focus more on what types of changes need to be implemented, and bringing in folks all across the spectrum to get behind those changes and make them happen.
I think that's spot on, and I feel like it echoes with Senator Booker's comments about kind of a national reckoning of the fact that we're not living our values in the justice system. And I remember the first time I saw the data point that, we've had protests in every single state in the country, and we've seen protests outside the US with, countries standing in solidarity with this moment and this movement. It does feel different, but let me rewind about 6 years. I would love for you to walk us through a little bit the origin story of Campaign Zero, your journey, the evolution of the work, and just kind of, I know many of us who are tuning in are familiar with you and your work, but please do give us the thumbnail sketch of who is Sam and how did Campaign Zero happen?
Yeah, so this started around the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, in the context of the Ferguson Uprising, the Baltimore Uprising, which was in April of 2015. And around that time, what became clear in those early sort of days and weeks and months of the movement was that, number one, from a data perspective, we really just didn't have the data or the tools to get a handle on how broad and how widespread police violence was in society, how different communities were being impacted by that violence. And that was sort of the first step to then being able to understand, how do we address this violence from a data-driven perspective. So the first thing that we did was building in the ability to collect the data that was not being collected. So the reason that the data wasn't available was because the federal government, even to this day, does not have comprehensive data on people killed by police, let alone all of the other forms of police violence that are far more frequent. They simply do not have the data in a comprehensive manner. They could tell you how much rainfall there was in rural Missouri going back 100 years. They could not tell you how many people were killed by the police this year or last year. So we had to build the capacity to track the data that the government wasn't tracking. And so I connected with organizers in Ferguson and across the country, and together we built Mapping Police Violence, which is the most comprehensive database of people killed by police. We launched it in early 2015. It became a template that organizations like The Guardian and The Washington Post then used for their databases that launched thereafter. And it became the first step to better understanding how widespread police violence was. So what we learned was that there were about 1,100 people killed by police every single year in this country. There were 1,100 people killed in 2013 and 2014 and 2015. This year, it is on pace to be about 1,100 people killed by police. So the numbers have been fairly static over time. They didn't start in 2014. This issue didn't end since then. What we also learned was that there were a set of cities that had consistently higher rates of police violence than other cities. So places like Orlando, Florida, Phoenix, Arizona, Oklahoma City, St. Louis, Baltimore, cities that had much higher rates of police violence than the national average. And we also learned when we disaggregated the data by race and by place that there were some cities that had lower rates of police violence than the national average. Even places like Detroit or Irvine, California, and that there were a set of policies and approaches that were being adopted in some cities that reduced police violence, whereas in other cities they simply had not adopted those solutions. So part of this work was starting with the outcomes, starting with, Campaign Zero is called Zero because we believe that we can live in a world where the police don't kill people. Zero, right? And so how do we get there? The first step was collecting the data, figuring out, are there places that have reduced police violence? How did they do it? And then identifying the policies, the practices, the approaches that got those places there and sought to document those and scale those through advocacy across the country. So that was sort of the origin of Campaign Zero, the goal of Campaign Zero. And I think since then, over the past 6 years, we've collected a host of data that we didn't have before and learned a lot about potential solutions that we simply didn't even consider before. So we weren't familiar in 2014 and 15 with the role of police unions and police union contracts in structuring the entire accountability system of police departments, and that a major factor in predicting rates of police violence was actually those contracts and the content of those contracts and how they affected the accountability process when police violence happens. We didn't understand how other issues impacted police violence as well. So in 2014, there was a big focus on body cameras across the country. Cities began to adopt it. There were a number of organizers who were fighting against body cameras, but in many cases, cities adopted them anyway. And now that we have so much data, what we can say is that these cameras actually didn't fundamentally change outcomes. They didn't change police violence rates. They didn't reduce police violence. They increased accountability slightly, but they didn't have the impact that a lot of people thought they would have. So now that we have the data, we can start evaluating interventions and solutions and think differently about what needs to happen in this moment to address police violence.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to talking about police scorecard, because it feels kind of like the logical progression from the initial figuring out what data do we have, what data do we need, and then looking at what are the underlying drivers of the outcomes that we see. And I feel like the police scorecard starts to get at that. Can you tell us a little bit about what motive, because I know there's a million different things you could take on in the data and technology space. So how did you zero in on that as something that you thought would be really helpful and transformative for police violence?
Yeah, so this all starts with the fact that there has not been comprehensive data available on police violence for so long. And once we have the data, once communities have access to that data, once cities can monitor that data and the trends over time, it allows you to make different decisions about what needs to happen to address these issues and which issues are the most severe right now in a given city that need to be taken on by legislators. So the Police Scorecard Project is a data dashboard. Currently, it is displaying at policescorecard.org data for the 100 largest cities in California, as well as all 58 county sheriff's departments in that state. We started in California because there's more data that has been made available on policing practices in California than other states because of the work of local organizers fighting for legislation like AB 953 that requires reporting of a whole host of things like police stops and searches and arrests and use of force that other states don't do. So started with California, decided to, at a high level, we're thinking, what are all of the indicators and metrics that communities and legislators would need to evaluate policing outcomes in a city? And so there are metrics related to use of force and police violence. Police shootings, other use of force, the racial disparities in how force was being used, the dynamics and circumstances of those incidents are one component of the scorecard. The second component is focused on accountability. When the police use force, when they commit misconduct, and people report them for it, how often does that result in any accountability for the officer? It turns out nationwide, it's only about 7% of all excessive force complaints lead to accountability. So one of the things in the scorecard is we track how often excessive force complaints result in accountability, how often complaints of police discrimination result in accountability, and a whole host of other metrics. And then finally wanted to ask broader questions around policing in general in a jurisdiction. So to what extent are police in a given city focused on racking up arrests for low-level offenses, for things like drug possession or sex work or homelessness and poverty? And to what extent were police in those same jurisdictions also focusing on issues of safety and violent crime? So were they actually clearing, when murders were reported, did they actually solve those murders? Or were they spending their resources instead on low-level offenses, locking people up for things that, frankly, the police should not be involved in the first place? So all of those things are part of the scorecard. We collected data on that for all of these departments and then integrated that into one comprehensive assessment that can compare to what extent are departments, what extent do departments fall along that spectrum. So, the goal of this quite simply is if we could evaluate policing in a city and across an entire state or across an entire country, how would that look like? What metrics would be included? And then how do we go about collecting all of the data needed to actually evaluate those things? So that's the goal of the project. And there are other things in there as well that are really important. So police funding is a big part of that. We evaluate the extent to which investments are being made in policing and incarceration versus things like education and housing and health and healthcare. So all of that is combined and available and accessible to people in communities for the first time through this project with the goal of allowing pressuring legislators and empowering communities to hold those elected officials and police chiefs accountable to changing those outcomes and actually getting results with regard to keeping people safe.
Oh, completely. And I think that's one of the pieces we found most compelling about the work is really it focuses on democratizing access to data. So that way individual communities are empowered to do just that and have data-driven conversations about what's happening in their own communities. And it all relies on the availability and collating of data, which I know can be extraordinarily manual at times. And we've had some conversations about the opportunity to apply natural language processing and other AI capabilities. What do you see in terms of the opportunity there to help accelerate impact by employing things like AI?
Yeah, so I do think that there's an opportunity there, in part because there are 18,000 different police jurisdictions in the United States. Each of those police agencies has their own set of policies and practices and outcomes and leadership. And so in order to truly scale this approach of evaluating those outcomes, of changing those outcomes across the country, we're going to need to collect data on an enormous number of police departments. And each of those departments, the data consists of an enormous number of documents that all have to be reviewed, that have to be coded, that have to be input into a database, and then have to be visualized and made accessible so that those findings can impact the dynamics on the ground. And so to do that, AI, natural language processing, is a really important potential tool to review documents very quickly, to review a police union contract, for example, or police use of force records, or a whole host of police complaint documents, and quickly code them up in ways that can allow this work to scale very rapidly to thousands and thousands of jurisdictions across the country, and provide that sort of granular detail on the dynamics happening within each.
Which is no small task. In concept, sounds fairly straightforward, but it's rather complicated. And well, what I really want to get to is kind of the thesis statement for this session, which is connecting data to impact. And something that, again, I think, Campaign Zero is just so effective at doing is not just kind of throwing the data over the wall and saying, everyone else go figure it out. I know you are, in communities, talking to policymakers, talking to leaders around like, what would this actually look like? So I would love to hear what you learned from that process of really trying to connect the data, either from, mapping police violence or police scorecard to conversations you're having with community leaders and especially local government to drive change.
So there are a number of examples, and I can pick a couple of them. For example, in Baton Rouge, I partnered with local organizers there, and we did a deep dive analysis of Baton Rouge Police Department and the police union contract, and a variety of other aspects of their policies and outcomes. And part of what is what has been so powerful about this work is in many cases, even the police departments, even the cities are not fully aware, in some cases not aware at all, of what the implications of their own data are. So I've been in rooms where I've said, are you aware that your police department's contract with the police union is one of the worst in the whole country, and has all of these different issues in there that obstruct the accountability process? And I've had city council members and police chiefs say, no, I didn't realize this was in the contract. This is actually like a really big deal. We're going to address this now. And similarly, what is also fascinating about this is there are a set of narratives in the absence of data. For so long, a set of myths and narratives have been used to justify existing police practices and outcomes. So, for example, in Orlando, Florida, the city where I'm from, I met with the police chief there and city officials and local organizers. And one of the narratives that the police chief and the city were using to defend their outcomes. So Orlando has the 4th highest rate of killings by police in the entire country. And one of the ways that they tried to defend those outcomes was by saying, the reason why these outcomes don't look good for us is because our city just has so many tourists. It's Orlando, Florida. We have Disney World, we have Universal, and those tourists are really rowdy, and they're on the Orange Avenue corridor, downtown Orlando. They're getting drunk in bars, and they're causing a lot of commotion, and our officers are responding to these challenging environments, and that's why they're using so much force. So nobody had interrogated these narratives, and without the data, it would be very hard to tell a police chief who's convinced that this is true, that it's not true. But with the data, what we could do is say, well, actually, Orlando, Florida has a rate of police violence that is more than 2 times higher than New Orleans or Las Vegas. And do you mean to tell me that the situation on Orange Avenue in Orlando, which by the way is not really intense at all, I grew up there, it's not a big deal, that situation is somehow more challenging than the Las Vegas Strip or Bourbon Street, where those officers are actually not using force to nearly that extent in those situations? And so the police chief there in Orlando was like, no, actually, I don't think that's true. We're going to take another look at this and actually change our policies. And they did change some of their policies in response to that. But without the data to be able to compare those cities, it would have been much more difficult to move past some of those sort of knee-jerk reactions and narratives that have persisted in particular places for so long and that have obstructed progress from being made. So part of this work is using the data intentionally as a tool to interrogate and dismantle some of the narratives that have been created that have prevented change from happening for so long. And there's a script. It's not just that narrative. There are narratives around crime and narratives around officer safety that just simply don't hold up when you interrogate them with the data. And by using the data to take those on directly, I think we can actually move towards a solutions conversation much quicker than we otherwise could have been.
I think that's one thing I found really encouraging about the nature of these conversations around justice reform is I hear people at least asking for data to say, this is what we think, but if there's contrary data, please let me know. And so my hope is at least that kind of creates a different type of a conversation from just you're right or you're wrong, you're good or you're bad, to what does the data actually show, so we can just go from there from a common frame of understanding. And I think the other thing that's frankly I would love to talk about more is how do you get all this work done? So you're very leanly staffed, you have an army of volunteers, and yet it seems like you're able to be everywhere all the time. To other organizations that aspire to do similar work to what you do, but want to operate in a pretty lean and agile fashion, any advice? What would you tell them? I'm sure there's folks who will watch later who have that same question.
So we have operated since 2014 with a relatively small budget, a relatively small team of sort of formal staff. What we have had are people across the country who have reached out to want to get involved, to want to help out, to want to address the issues in their communities. And so part of this work is both by necessity, because we just didn't have the resources, and also by design. How do we create as many on-ramps into this work as possible for as many people as possible? Recognizing that sort of the existing infrastructure of organizations and networks is actually not sufficient to deal with the scale of interest and enthusiasm and engagement in this issue right now by millions of people across the country. So if you look at polls, for example, recent polls, looking at support for the Black Lives Matter movement, it shows that there are about 67% of American adults support Black Lives Matter, which is about 170 million US adults. So by comparison, there are maybe 60 million people or 62 million people voted for Donald Trump, 65 million people or so voted for Hillary Clinton, 170 million people support the Black Lives Matter movement. And so the question is actually at this stage is not how do we convince new people to support the work, to care about police violence, to address it. It's rather how do we actually leverage and bring on board and build the capacity of the millions of people across the country who want to get involved, but are simply looking for a way to do that. And how do we help them realize their own power, understand the data, use the data in their work to create change locally in every one of those 18,000 police jurisdictions across the country. And so part of the work has been building an infrastructure digitally on Slack, through a variety of surveys and sign-up forms, through digital campaigns that can bring in thousands and thousands of people, help build their capacity to understand these issues, and then involve them in the data collection, in the data, finding data sets, finding police budget documents, finding police union contracts online, training people how to review that information, enter it into a spreadsheet, and then working with data visualizers and designers who can help bring those spreadsheets to life. And that has been the process. And so in the process, what that means is not only do I know how to do this work, and a few people within the organization know how to do this work, but now we have people all across the country who know more about how to collect the data, how to review the data, how to visualize the data, how to use the data in their advocacy than otherwise would have through this process. So that has been part of the process. Obviously that can be a gift and a curse. If you move too quickly, you can run into issues. If you move too slowly, you can sort of miss an opportunity to actually mobilize people around critical issues and critical windows to make impact. So it is always a balance. I think organizations are trying to find that balance overall in the context of their structures, but that has been our approach to date.
Well, it occurs to me as you're talking, you guys have been through kind of two massive surges in heightened interest and awareness around police violence generally as an issue, and certainly, people's awareness of the work that you're doing. If you were to go back to 2014, 2015, Sam, and give yourself advice around how to absorb that massive swell of interest, what would you tell yourself? Would you do anything differently, I guess?
Yes. So I'll give you an example. In 2016 or so, we launched a survey that the goal of which was to sign people up and get them involved in the work. A whole host of different projects, from data collection to data visualization, to organizing, to policy work, and completely underestimated the level of interest and engagement we would get in a short amount of time. So we launched a survey. It was a basic sort of type form survey online. It asked people, how many hours a week do they have to contribute? What types of experience did they have with this work coming into it? Not that they had to have any prior experience, and asked them, what type of work did they want to do? And based on that, we had about 18,000 people sign up in 2 weeks. And so, we're talking about a massive CSV file that I ended up getting that had maybe 20 or 30 columns of detailed information from each person on how they wanted to get involved. People were uploading resumes and portfolios. And so there was no way that I could have gone through all 18,000 of those rows. So we had to cut off signups after 2 weeks. If we kept signing people up, there would have been even more, but simply could not handle that level of engagement and sign up around this at the time. And so if you don't build the structures to effectively onboard people at the scale that you might end up getting, then that can be an issue too, right? You can move too quickly. So what ended up happening is we actually signed up a whole bunch of people into Slack groups, those people are the people who helped review policies and contracts and visualize information for a whole host of later projects. So we did actually get a lot of people involved in substantive ways and made impact, but could never sort of reach the scale of engagement at that time. And so a lot of people probably signed up and were like, I don't know what's going on, I want to get involved, but it seems like they can't get me involved right now in the work. So what you don't want to do is launch something and then people are sort of wondering, what's really going on? I signed up, I haven't heard back. So that can be an issue if you move too quickly. At the same time, again, I think that this is a huge challenge for many organizations across the sector, across social justice work, because there are always more people who care about this work than are actively engaged in it in a moment across a whole host of issues. So if you look at gun control, that is also an issue where there are millions of people who care about that issue, and maybe a fraction of that many people are actually involved in the advocacy in a given moment. If you look at climate change, same thing. If you look at reproductive justice, same thing. So immigration, same thing. And I think in general as a sector, one of the fundamental challenges that we're all working to figure out solutions to is how do we scale up the involvement and engagement and bring on board more and more people to actually leverage the full potential of a movement and direct it towards substantive changes, while at the same time doing it in a really intentional and deliberate way that can actually meet the moment and effectively engage and contact and stay in contact with so many people over time. And I don't think anybody's really figured this out fully, but I do think that this is a challenge we're going to have to figure out. Technology has to play a role in scaling that. And if we don't figure that out, then we're just like leaving millions and millions of people who could be involved out at a time when we really need them on board.
Completely. And I guess I have a parallel question along that lines. When you think about the involvement of corporate America, so we've seen a lot of announcements recently of companies investing in racial equity and racial justice, and ours included. I would love to hear your thoughts on what's the best way, or what are actually helpful ways for corporations to be involved in ways that are empowering and in ways that lead to long-term sustainable change versus not just one-time kinds of solutions. So I would love to hear covet your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think oftentimes it's complicated. It depends on the organization and the corporation and how they're currently involved in some of these things. But what's clear is that a statement is not enough, right? That it has to be a corporation that is going to interrogate its own practices, its own relationships to various stakeholders and to the system, and its own processes and technology and algorithms, and interrogate all of those to figure out, are these being used to advance justice, or are they being used to reinforce existing systems that cause harm? It also means that companies are interrogating their board and their staff and their leadership to better include voices of people who are directly impacted by some of these issues. And so it is a host of different things that need to happen. It is also making amends for any harm that may have been caused in the past. So there are a whole lot of corporations that actually were around during Jim Crow and segregation, that were around actually during slavery, and profited from that in their founding, in how they built the original wealth that they then used to become a corporation. And that has to, there are particular corporations that need to have those conversations and actually need to make amends for that legacy. And the wealth that they built actually in many cases isn't theirs, right? It was built by people who were never compensated for that labor, and their descendants ought to be compensated now. And so there are a whole host of issues that corporations need to wrestle with that are much more substantive than sort of what is your current stance on the issue or current language around the issue, but it is how as a corporation are we showing up in society, in politics, on policy, and are there ways that we could be showing up in ways that could be even more substantive and even more helpful?
Completely agree. Speaking of policy, there's been a lot of policy conversation that centers around concepts like defunding the police, disaggregating the role of police, reimagining public safety. Curious, if you were to have to pick one of those titles or monikers, which one you would pick, or rather what they generally are all pointing to, and some of if there's any nuance that you think is maybe missing in some of those concepts.
I think this is exactly the conversation that we need to be having, because we've seen police budgets just continue to increase year over year over year, while a whole host of services that actually support impacted communities are being cut. And now, of all times, we're seeing huge cuts to budgets at the city and state level due to COVID and a host of other issues. And so the question is, where do those cuts come from in this moment? And where should cities and states and us as a country be making investments that can actually keep people safe rather than investing in systems that cause harm? And so, just to back up and talk about some of the data here, the data is on the side of defund, right? The data is quite clear that the money that is being poured into police departments, that the vast majority of that money is actually not being used at all to keep anybody safe, and is instead going towards the policing of things that ought not to even have a police officer on the scene. So, for example, a New York Times investigation or analysis in the Upshot just came out a few days ago, which looks at calls for service data, 911 calls, for a variety of big cities across the country. The cities actually make the data available because not every city does this. What they found was only about 1% of all of the calls, the 911 calls, were in response to a violent crime. Only about 4% in total of the amount of time that police officers spend on a typical shift was focused on violent crime. And that the vast majority of what police were spending time on were things that another institution could have handled far better than the police. So, we look at 20% of all calls, 911 calls nationwide, are for mental health issues. Now, there are cities like in Eugene, Oregon, with the Cahoots program, where you have a mental health provider responding to those issues instead of a police officer. A far more effective strategy that lets experts respond to situations they're experts in, rather than somebody with a gun responding to a situation they're not trained in, and that they often escalate in ways that cause serious harm, if not death. Similarly, issues of poverty and homelessness. So 1 in every 3 use of force incidents in LA, and the majority of use of force incidents in Portland, according to their own data, are against homeless people. So, this should not be something that is being policed, but rather we should be giving folks resources and housing so that that folks aren't out in the streets. So again, there are a host of things where defunding the police, cutting that budget, cutting the funding that is going into the policing of all of these activities, into units like narcotics divisions and vice divisions that specialize in arresting people for low-level offenses, funding that is going to paying the salaries of police officers who have records of misconduct. All of that needs to be shifted as a first step, not the last step, into community-based alternatives, scaling those up, resourcing them to actually respond to the scene of these issues in ways that are far more effective at keeping people safe, at preventing crime, and not causing harm. So I think that's like big picture what this moment recognized. I think long-term it is about fundamentally re-envisioning and reimagining what public safety looks like beyond policing entirely. So, what would it look like to have just a completely different system and structure and approach to the full range of issues that police are currently being called into, and how do we explore those options? How do we evaluate those options? How do we scale them up and resource them to ultimately become a reality over time?
Well, you read my mind, because I was going to end with asking you about the potential use of 911 dispatch data and kind of trends for the future, but I feel like you definitely explored those topics. And I know we have at least a couple of questions from folks who are watching. So Kevin, if you want to come back on screen and ask Sam some questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, I would love to. And, I know we're coming close to our time and we want to get to some of the audience questions. Just a couple of things, that I heard and took away from that conversation, which was super interesting. You guys did such a great job. So, I heard you, Sam, over the past few years, we spent so much time sort of convincing people, and specifically white communities, that this was a national crisis, right? It is a national crisis. And now there appears to be some more consensus around that this is an issue, that things must change, that this is really feeling like an inflection point. And so I think, we can be hopeful about that. A major factor, another thing I heard you say in predicting police violence is police contracts. And we've heard a lot about how problematic these contracts are, I think, lately in terms of, maintaining the status quo and protecting officers who engage in misconduct. But you pointed out that this connection is actually a lot deeper than that. And so I think this just adds to, the sort of body of evidence, if you will, that suggests we really need to be thinking through these police contracts and taking a stance on them if we want to affect change. Data has been a game changer because it helps deconstruct false narratives. That was something that I took away from the conversation, I thought was a really good point, that have been used to sort of justify use of force in the status quo, the lack of institutional policies on use of force. The data can really be a powerful tool, again, if it's connected to really sort of driving impact on the ground. So with that, let's go ahead, take a couple of questions from the audience. The first one I want to point to here, so historically, Sam, this is going to be to you, and Marisa, certainly if you have perspective on this, jump in as well. Historically, why did police data have to be filed or shared regarding police violence? It seems like that's really counterintuitive, right? That and there's no sort of accountability there. It's just kind of shocking to folks. So I think really wondering if you can provide some historical context around why that is the case.
Yeah, so there are a couple of reasons. One of the challenges to collecting police data is that, again, there are 18,000 different police agencies, and they all have different systems for collecting the data, reporting various things like use of force, categorizing those incidents, how they track it, the data systems they use to track it, and then there are a variety of different state laws limiting access to police data. So it's sort of a patchwork of laws and regulations and department practices that means it's very difficult to have the types of data that would allow you in a consistent and reliable way to compare policing outcomes across the country. That's the fundamental challenge. Now, why that is, one is it's this decentralized nature of policing in the United States, but two, it's also a question of political will. So there are similar issues that the federal government does track that are decentralized. So if you go to the Office of Civil Rights Data Collection within the Department of Education, their website, they actually have data on every school in America at the school level. They have data on the number and demographics of students attending the school, who's getting suspended, both in school and out of school suspensions, referrals to law enforcement, school-based arrests, all of it by race, by gender, by disability status. So they actually publish that data every single year on every single school in America. And the federal government found a way, the Department of Education found a way through funding, probably through conditioning funding, through various education programs in the Obama administration, to collect that data in a systematic way in a highly decentralized system. So there's no reason that can't be done in policing. In fact, even if you look at arrest data and crime data, that's being reported from most jurisdictions across the country every single year in a fairly reliable way. So when it comes to police use of force, when it comes to police accountability, that data is actually much harder to find. So there's a question about political will. Part of what we've seen over the past several years have been efforts at the state level to create standards and mandates around police data reporting and collection and publishing that have gone in effect in particular states like California that make it a little bit easier now to evaluate policing practices in those states. But there are a host of states that don't yet do this. And what that means is to do that work, you have to collect data from each one of these agencies across the country and try to do the work of actually standardizing that data in ways that can be very difficult. So if the police department just doesn't report any use of force incident, for example, that doesn't involve a police weapon like a baton or taser, then there's a whole bunch of data that simply is just not being reported, is not even being collected, that can't be in an analysis. So those are some of the issues that you struggle with when you don't have these statewide or federal mandates that establish clear standards on what is required to be reported that they can actually enforce.
Got it. Okay. Super
And
helpful.
I'll add on a couple of thoughts there on top of what Sam just said, which I think covered it really well. But I think what's interesting, the fundamental assumption behind the question is that we should have all of this data. And I think part of what's really powerful of trying to open the lid to the car a little bit is to see, no, we don't have all the data, even in this, age of 2020 where we're saturated with information. So I think that's another part of the work that we're trying to do as well, is just to identify those places where we think there should be data, but there just isn't yet.
And the last thing, just to add on to this, there are only 12 states right now where police misconduct is public. It's going to become 13 states now because they repealed 50A in New York, which was huge and just happened over this past week. But again, 13 states where police misconduct records in their entirety are considered public record, which doesn't mean that they're posted online. It means that we can get them through public records requests. In the vast majority of states, right, the other 37 states, police misconduct records are either partially or entirely kept hidden from public view. So what that means is if I wanted to know, if I want to get records of all of the police misconduct complaints and all of the officers that were named in those complaints, or who are the officers involved in all of the use of force incidents in a given city, they won't be able to provide that. Even if the police department or the city wanted to provide the data legally, they'd be barred from providing us with the data, and they just refuse to do so in many situations because they're not legally required to under the public records law. So changing the law is also a strategy towards getting better data. And the last piece of this is sometimes they have data that they then delete. So in Phoenix, for example, as per their police union contract, records of police misconduct are purged periodically on a regular basis. So an investigation by the Arizona Republic found that 90% of all records of police misconduct in Phoenix, again, one of the cities with the highest rates of police violence in the country, 90% of those records were destroyed. In Chicago, a judge just had to step in and stop the destruction of all police misconduct records that are older than 5 years old in Chicago because that was in their police union contract. So again, all these things are part of a system and they all play together, but the result of it is it's very difficult to get the data. Much of the data gets destroyed or erased over time, and it will take changes to state laws to allow us to get all of the data on the front end to prevent that from happening.
Got it. I think we have time for at least one more. So how do you ensure data security? So some of the data you're collecting is considered sensitive or potentially risky for a user to share should it get in the wrong hands. Is this line of questioning too paranoid?
No, it's not paranoid. And there are situations where it makes total sense to implement strict privacy measures to prevent certain aspects of data from getting shared. So I'll give you an example. We obtained data on civilian complaints from a major U.S. city, St. Louis, that the complaints that they gave us actually contained the names and addresses of the people who complained, which in many cases means people who were reporting sexual assaults, who were reporting some of the worst things that had ever happened to them. The department was just sharing that information with whoever requests it, with the public, and we don't believe that information should just be put on blast. Like, people should not have their private information revealed in those ways. What is also true is that there's a host of data that is often protected ostensibly for privacy reasons that actually probably shouldn't be protected. So there are many researchers who do research on police misconduct who collect information on the officers who have shot somebody or committed misconduct, and they have the names and the badge numbers and the demographics of every officer that has shot somebody over the past 5 years in some of these studies, and they make the decision not only not to release the officer's information, so the only information that is ever made public in these incidents, in many cases, is the name of the person who was harmed and not the officer, or the criminal record of somebody who was harmed by police, but never the misconduct record of the officer. So there's a power dynamic here where it is not that cut and dry. And in situations where the names and the records of people who are harmed by the police is already public, it actually makes sense to also release that information on the officers to even out some of those power dynamics, and allow for interrogations of the system itself that caused that harm. So there's a balance here, and each case has to be evaluated with that in mind. But I do think, obviously, there are cases where it makes a lot of sense to prevent some information from getting released publicly that could cause harm to people who reported police misconduct, people who may have, said that they were actually involved in activity that they don't want to share publicly, but the police came in and responded to that in ways that were clearly excessive and violent. And so clearly it's the case of police misconduct, but we also don't want to compromise somebody's own, legal defenses in some cases. So it can be complicated, and part of it is being able to work through that complexity in ways that protect communities to the greatest extent possible.
Great, thanks. I know we're coming close to time here. I think we can squeeze in one more. So let me just ask this, and Sam will, flag we're closing in at the end of time, so we'll have to keep the answer short. But yeah, so you're partnering directly with law enforcement on the Policing Scorecard project. Can you talk through quickly, like, how is this work perceived in the law enforcement community? Because I really think it's important for folks to understand sort of what that relationship looks like and what the response looks like and how you're dealing with it. And I know that may be a lot to answer in 90 seconds, but do your best.
So just to clarify, we partner with local organizations that work to address police violence. We work to inform and provide data for city leaders and law enforcement folks, police chiefs and others, to better understand some of the underlying dynamics within their department, some of the findings of the data, in many cases that they're reporting and publishing online, or that provided through public records requests, to provide cover in many cases for local organizers who have experienced these issues for a long time, but didn't have the data to demonstrate how widespread these issues were, or connect those to very particular places and policies and issues that were generating these incidents time and time again. And so part of what that work looks like is obtaining the data on policing, all the data that we can obtain under state law, and then putting together an analysis that allows for everyone from local communities to city council members to police chiefs to look at this data dashboard and say, well, it looks like our police department has a whole host of issues and things that need to be most urgently addressed. And among those, the data is showing that use of force, deadly force, accountability, arrests for these types of activities, that these are some of the core fundamental issues that have the largest racial disparities, where the department is exceeding national averages to the greatest extent, and where an intervention is most urgently needed. And so that's sort of what the data can help do. It also means that the way that is received by law enforcement depends on the city, and there are very different reactions. There are police chiefs who are interested in the data that actually check the scorecard to see whether they're making progress on particular indicators or not. And ultimately, these are not just indicators, not just data. We're talking about people's lives. We're talking about a reduction in the number of people who are killed, or fewer arrests, things that are directly impacting people, and where changes in those outcomes mean that people's lives are better. So there are some law enforcement folks that actually pay attention to those things and care about those things, and want to propose, at least come to the table to understand what they should be doing better on those things, and be connected to local organizers who can push them on them. There are also, particularly police unions and some law enforcement leaders in more conservative areas, that are sort of impervious to the data, right? That don't really want to change anything, and where a different strategy is needed, a strategy of maybe electoral organizing to change the leadership at the city level and change the police chief, or radical organizing around defunding or disbanding a given police department that just refuses to change any outcomes or change any practices. So there's a set of tools and approaches depending on the particular city, but we've seen a host of different reactions to the data. I think what's most important and fascinating about all this is the data actually presents probably a better picture of policing outcomes than the reality, because so much goes unreported, and that so much of this data, we're dependent on police departments to provide the data. It's their data in some cases, and so even with their data, the situation often doesn't look good, and I think that helps compel cities to take action in cases where they might not otherwise.
Great, thank you. So we're out of time. I want a huge thank you to Marisa, Sam, for your time today and for running through this discussion. A big thanks to the audience as well, and to the organizers. I'll quickly point out, for those interested in checking out the Police Scorecard project, there is a link in the handout box on the screen, which is next to the Twitter icon there in the chat window. Feel free to check it out. And again, very grateful for all your participation today. Thank you.